everyone. My name is Cayley Hauser, and I'm very excited to be talking with you guys today about centrality algorithms, which are a part of the broader suite of graph data science algorithms. A little bit about me real quick. I'm a consulting engineer with Neo4j, so I am lucky enough to get to spend pretty much all of my time hands-on working with customers, helping them achieve their goals and understand their graphs better. I live in the DC area, although today I'm presenting to you from my in-laws' house in Indiana. So I'm really excited. Good morning, afternoon, and night to everyone around the world today. Now, when I first put this talk together for another venue a few months ago, this was originally titled Graph Data Science for Non-Data Scientists. So I'm a data scientist, I have a data science background, and I'm really passionate about algorithms. But I want to help make these algorithms more accessible to everyone. So whether you're a graph expert, a graph enthusiast, or maybe even a beginner, I'm hoping that our talk today will help you understand centrality algorithms, but more importantly, how those centrality algorithms can help you answer your business questions and solve your business problems and ultimately get a lot more value out of your graph. So let's go ahead and get started. So to begin with, we are going to have to answer the question, what is centrality? At its core, centrality is trying to answer the question, what nodes are the most important in your graph? And due to the nature of this, centrality algorithms are a suite of algorithms that are really unique to graph. And as a data scientist, this is one of the reasons I find centrality so interesting. There are many kinds of graph data science algorithms out there, far more than we're going to cover today. And many of them investigate things like clustering, prediction, neural networks, and others. But centrality is really a graphical use case because it's trying to answer what is the most important part of my graph. And it's a question that there's not really a one-to-one comparison for some of our traditional tabular machine learning models. Now, of course, if I ask you what is the most important node in your graph, the answer is always going to be, well, it depends. It depends on your graph. It depends on your question. There's no one size fits all answer to the question, what is the most important part of my graph? But a lot of our questions tend to be based on a certain structure of the graph, a certain way the nodes are connected to the other nodes. And this is what our different centrality measures are trying to exploit to help us answer this question based on the specific use case. Like I said, it depends on what you mean by important. Now, today, we're not going to necessarily do the traditional approach for how we teach data science algorithms. So if you've ever taken a data science class, whether formally or through something like a boot camp, you've probably seen something like this before, where I might teach you an algorithm. I might say, this is the mathematical representation of this centrality measure, and then maybe give you some examples of here's some code, and then send you on your way. But we're not going to be doing that today. Now, if you are a hands-on developer, don't worry. There are many, many free resources for learning hands-on graph data science at your fingertips if you just visit our website. But today we're going to be focusing on a different approach because, like I said at the beginning, I want to focus on understanding these centrality measures and how to relate them to our business problems. Because if I just taught you the math and maybe you went away knowing a little bit more about degree centrality or eigenvector centrality, and I'll tell you what those are in a little bit, sometimes that leads to a disconnect between our algorithms and the business problems that they solve. So today, we're going to take it in a different direction. We're going to look at what these algorithms do and some examples of the questions that they can answer. And I'm hoping that whether you're a developer who's hands-on, or you're a data scientist, or maybe if you're a manager or a strategist in your business, if you have a graph, I want this to help inspire you for understanding how you can use centrality measures to help identify what the key parts of your data set are. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So What do you need to know about centrality algorithms? Well, a lot of people think, oh, there's no point in learning about these algorithms because I need to memorize them, like I said earlier. And if you're a data scientist, this is definitely worth investigating. If you're more interested in getting that in-depth look, like I said, we have in-depth documentation for all of the algorithms I'll be talking today on our website. You can learn the algorithms there, the formulas, and get a deeper dive on when the right time is to use those. But for the rest of us, it's still important to learn about centrality. What kinds of questions are centrality questions? What are the different kinds of centrality? And how can we connect those to business problems? These are the things that I'm hoping you'll be able to learn more about today. And by the way, if you are interested in those now, I know that we're throwing up some links in the session chat for you to get more information on that. All right, next slide. All right, today we're going to focus on recognizing these questions and understanding the importance, like I said. So let's get into it. All right. So centrality questions, when I talk about business problems, the most important part of your graph, that's kind of abstract. But we're actually asking these kinds of questions all the time, no matter your industry or your space. If you have a graph or if your data is connected like a graph, as almost everyone's are, then we have centrality questions that we can apply to this graphical data to get these answers on what's the most important part of our graph. The challenge can be identifying what kinds of questions are these centrality/importance questions. So let's go through some examples. Who are my most important customers? That's a common question that we're asking. Who's our most important? Now, of course, we could break that down more, right? Who are customers that bring in the most profit? Who are our customers that are the most likely to churn, right? Most important can even vary within that, but this is an example of a common question that we might be asking. Here's another example of a centrality question. Where are the vulnerabilities in my security system? Now, that might not exactly sound like what's the most important thing. It's a little bit different flavor. But if you're thinking about it, if you have a graph, for example, of your security infrastructure, you want to know where the vulnerabilities are. This actually is a centrality question. All right. What's the weakest link in my supply chain? Kind of similar idea, right? What is that most important node based on linkage? What step in my customer pipeline should I focus on, right? Potentially a customer journey use case that you're investigating. Is there a bottleneck that I might be missing? Who is committing fraud? This is also a very common use case, right? If I'm trying to do some sort of fraud detection, this is very important for understanding what the most important thing is in your graph. And in this case, it might be a fraudulent account or a fraudulent actor. All of these things can be answered with centrality. Another one, which influencers should I target for my product marketing? This is very specific, but influencers in a network, whether that be a literal social media influencer or another kind of just an influential person, this is very important. These are all questions that we're constantly answering. And the reason I'm giving you all these examples is because I want you to start priming your brain again, as we're going through these, to start thinking, oh, maybe this question that I've been trying to tackle is a centrality question. And if so, which centrality algorithm can I apply to that? And I'm going to talk about some of the most common algorithms as we move on and show you exactly how they help you answer these sorts of questions of finding the most important part of your graph. All right. So to give you the highest level overview, I said, yes, a centrality question is the most important part of your graph, but specifically, it's when you're asking what nodes are important based on the structure of your data or of your graph. What exactly do I mean by that? I'll just give you a quick example. If I have a graph, for example, of everyone who works for the federal government, and I tell you the most important node in that graph is your president, then I don't need an algorithm or even any sort of search to know that that node is the most important. If you already know the answer, right? If it's a simple search, oh, the person, this, the president's the most important, then I don't need an algorithm to help me understand that. But a lot of the time, like I said before, we're looking at it based on the structure of your data. So what customer purchased the most items, right? What piece of my security infrastructure is the most vulnerable? Asking these questions requires you to understand the actual makeup of your data. And this is why, going back to something I mentioned at the beginning, this is why it's so difficult to do this without a graph, with your typical tabular data, because it's based on that interconnected structure. And nothing wrong, I spent very many years analyzing tables as a data scientist, but it's difficult to get an answer to a question like this. And so this is where these centrality algorithms can really help you exploit that part of your graph and understand, based on the structure, based on the nodes, based on the relationships, what is the most important. All right. Now, right, one last stop before we get into some specific algorithms. You might be asking, especially if you've worked with graph for a while, well, why do we need centrality? Potentially, right? I could write maybe a cipher query, right? A piece of code. I could write some code to say, show me the top 5 customers that based on how many things they purchased. Why do I need a centrality algorithm to answer a question about what is the most important? Well, there's several reasons that you may want to consider using a centrality algorithm, even if you have some existing code that might answer some simple questions. The first reason is this hard-coded information in Cypher or Python might have to be changed often as you change your definition of importance or the structure of your graph. It's always hard to maintain that specific query if you're trying to find that needle in a haystack. Also, a lot of times if you're not using an algorithm, you're having to sort and filter, and it's difficult to kind of manually know where to stop or what is actually the most important. It's very simple and can be kind of clunky. And of course, again, changing those nodes or relationships you're interested in, updating that query, it takes time. So these algorithms really help because they run on all nodes in your graph. And especially if you're using the graph data science library with Neo4j, it's parallelized, it's efficient, it's built to be run on your whole graph and give you that information that you're interested in. It's easy to visualize. You can save that information and use it for visualizations, or save it as a property that can be used later to enhance the data in your graph. And finally, some centrality measures are just too complex for you to do in code. There's just no way for you to easily calculate that without an algorithm to do so. And this is why these algorithms themselves are very powerful and can do a lot more than just trying to find it through simple code. All right. So now let's begin looking at some of the different types of centralities that we have. This is not an exhaustive list of every single kind of centrality that is available in Neo4j's graph data science library, but these are some of the most common ones and what you'll see used most frequently in a lot of applications. So let's talk about some of the most common centralities and how do we define what is important. All right. So the first centrality we'll talk about today is degree centrality. And this is very simple. You may have thought about this if you've used graphs before. We just want to know the node with the most relationships. This is when we're interested in the node that has the most relationships is the most important. This has many applications. We might say, like I said before, which customer buys the most products? Which customer has filed the most complaints about products? Who are the users that have the most connections in our social network? The neighborhood that has the most police reports, potentially. I've done some analysis on crime before. This is a use case I've seen. The product that sold at the most locations, the person who signed up for the most events. This is a very common use case, counting things, the number of relationships that nodes have in our graph. Now, this can get a lot more nuanced. You may only care about relationships that point out, relationships that go in. You may want to weight it based on some property of the relationship. There's many options for what you can do, even with something as simple as degree centrality. But even though it's simple, it's very powerful. You want to know what node is the most connected in a specific way. So if you are interested in saying, I want to know the answer to this question of which node's the most important based on how many relationships it has. And of course, you can filter to the kind of relationship that's all possible. Degree centrality helps you understand that kind of importance. Let's talk about the next type of centrality. Betweenness centrality. I think this one is very interesting, and it can kind of answer two different types of importance questions. This I like to call looking for the bottlenecks or the bridges. This is when you have a specific node where it really, the name is well named, right? It's between, it has a high level of betweenness, right? And this is what you're looking for. It's really good for if you're looking for a bottleneck where something might be getting slowed down, or a vulnerability, or potentially it's a bridge. Maybe it's a good thing. You want to find the node that connects different groups in your graph. And that's what you can do with betweenness centrality. But how would we actually apply this to some business problems? Well, here's some examples. Like I mentioned before, a step in a supply chain that could be a bottleneck. If we see one of those nodes with a really high betweenness score, we might say, oh, if this were to be taken out, this would be very impactful on our supply chain. Potentially, we want to introduce some mitigations there. Maybe a sales representative that has had success in multiple different groups, right? So let's say you have a social network. In a social network, if a node has high betweenness score, that means that they connect groups of people that typically aren't connected to each other. That might be someone who's very interesting depending on your use case. Again, a key step in a security system. In this picture, maybe that dark node in the middle is my single sign-on, for example. If a bad actor is able to access that one node, they're suddenly able to have way more access into the network. So this can be a really important algorithm for the cybersecurity space. Again, a high priority station in a manufacturing line. That's a common potential use case. Or maybe even, I live in the DC area. I drive in a lot of traffic. A road that could cause high impact during construction if you're in something like city planning, right? This is where betweenness centrality can really help us identify nodes that are important based on how they're going to affect the nodes around them. And again, whether that's flow of information, flow of goods and services, security, this can really help us answer some of those key questions in our business use cases every day. All right, let's move on to eigenvector centrality. And I say that because I always think the name eigenvector centrality is very fun. It brings back my math undergraduate days. But eigenvector centrality is kind of an interesting centrality. It's all about measuring influence. And so this is when you're interested in the node with the most influence is the most important. And this is often used in human-based social networks. So there's an actual paper where they've investigated this, I believe several papers, where they investigated this with terrorist groups. So this was government use cases, right? They said, what terrorists in a network have a high level of influence on each other, right? We want to know if people are sharing information, potentially people are sharing information about things on the internet or threats. Who is the influence in that? Because that's probably the person that we're the most interested in and that we may want to investigate more. Or potentially, if you're just looking at something a bit less nefarious, maybe marketing, what Facebook users might have the most influence in a specific network? Which political figure has a strong influence on their party? This might be interesting for anyone doing political or policy analysis. These are the kinds of questions that eigenvector centrality can measure. And if you're more interested in the math in any of these, if you want to learn more about why eigenvector centrality uses eigenvectors, I want you to go and analyze that, of course. But again, for those of us who aren't potentially working in math every single day, what I want you to take away is if you need to measure influence and how a node is affecting other nodes, specifically via a sharing information kind of mechanism, eigenvector centrality can really help you get an answer to that question. So let's move on to another similar idea that you may have seen before. This is a very famous algorithm originally developed by Google, is PageRank. There's also article rank, which is very slightly different, but it's pretty similar. So I include them on the same slide since they have a similar idea. This is when the node with the most influence based on direction, if you read the math, is the most important, otherwise known as a node that has the high inflow is the most important. So this was originally developed by Google's team, and you may have heard this. This is how it powered their search algorithm. And this initially was built to find important websites to recommend in a search based on citations, right? So if something is being cited by many other sources, then it might be more important. And that's what PageRank was originally developed to help us discover. One way that I like to think about PageRank and can kind of help me think about the intuition behind it is like if you gave each node $1 and then each round of the algorithm, it split up that dollar among all of the outgoing relationships. So if I'm a node and I have $1 and I have 2 outgoing relationships, I give each of those nodes 50 cents. And so it's kind of this algorithm that looks for where the inflow is going. What business use cases have we seen? Well, I actually have seen this sometimes with fraud use cases, right? For example, you might actually be wanting to see where the money is going in a real life use case. Or you might want to use Google's use case. What links should be recommended from a search? You could do it for public transit, right? This is what subway station might end up getting the highest amount of traffic. Or an actual common use case, what bike share stop is receiving the most inventory, right? So you think about something like city bike shares, if your city has that, the bikes don't all get picked up and dropped off at the same locations organically. They have to be trucked around the city to make sure they're distributed in the places where people want to use them. PageRank can help understand that flow. Or potentially what unit of the hospital is having the highest influx of patients. These are all questions that you might be able to explore more with a PageRank or article rank algorithm. All right, let's move on to a few more interesting types of centralities. So let's talk about closeness centrality. This is, again, exactly what it sounds like. Some of these are very well named. The node that is the closest to all the other nodes in the graph is the most important. This is when you're looking for that node that is as closely related to as many other nodes as possible, really the most centrally located node in your graph. Why might we be interested in a question like this? Well, you could say, what's the most efficient way to disseminate important information to the public, right? We're looking for where can we put information that is going to get to the most people. You could say, if I'm trying to target a specific person in a social network, maybe for marketing or some other purposes, who has the most access to all of the other people in the social network that I'm trying to reach? Maybe I'll go to them because they're the closest to the most other people. Or where's the most central location for all of us to choose for a company meeting if we're a distributed company? These are all closeness questions. So if the most important node in your graph is based on how close it is to other nodes, you may want to explore using closeness centrality to help answer that question. All right, this is, I think, one of the most interesting ones. It's CELF centrality. I always want to mix up and say clef, but that's not correct. This is all about spread. I know it's been a few years now that we've begun to move out of the COVID pandemic, but if you remember, spread was a word we talked about a lot back then. And this is exactly what that's measuring. What if a node is spreading something through relationships to other nodes, it has a higher level of this centrality. So going back to COVID, what COVID infected person would likely infect the most people? So again, in this picture, if that center node became infected, it has a lot of outgoing relationships to potentially spread that infection to other nodes. Or kind of like closeness, maybe not exactly, because this is a bit more specific. Which social media platform will spread information the farthest in the internet? So again, if you want something to go from one node and spread to the other nodes, or if you don't want that, you can use this algorithm to figure out where those points are in your graph that's the most likely to happen. Let's go back to that use case at the beginning. Which security gateway would allow a potential intrusion to spread the farthest into a network? This is all measured by this type of centrality. And now you may notice that some of these are similar questions, similar use cases, right? The exact type of centrality you use can vary, and it can be very specific to the exact kind of problem that you're interested in. But that's what makes centrality so great, is that there's so many different types of centralities, even more than I've been able to go through today. And you can read all the documentation on the website at the links provided in the chat to understand better exactly the one that you should use for this use case. But even though there's more, I know I've already covered a lot today, and it's a lot to remember exactly what eigenvector does and exactly what degree is. And the good news is, I don't think you have to remember every single algorithm or what every single one does, because that documentation is available and it's always going to change a little bit based on your use case. But what I hope you remember from the session today is that centrality questions are questions about node importance based on the structure of your graph. And these are very relevant to many different questions in pretty much every single kind of graph anywhere with any business use case. Centrality measures various kinds of importance, such as number of relationships. It can help you find bridges or bottlenecks in your data. It can look for important nodes based on closeness, influence, or even spread. So, what is the conclusion of our session today? Almost everyone has centrality questions. You'd be hard pressed to find a business use case that doesn't have something that they need centrality for. If you have a graph and you have connected data, it's very likely that some of your questions can be answered with centrality algorithms. Identifying these questions and applying those algorithms to help answer them will help you access even more value from the graph that you're using for your business use case. And with that, I will finish my presentation today. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat, but that is all of the material I have.